So just to continue on a little bit with where we were, because I didn't really finish the second part. If we look at the hadith in the 40 hadiths, which is really what I've been dealing with all along, the hadith talks about, there's actually 4 subjects. The first subject is Islam, which we covered. And the second was Iman, which we covered at a very basic level. And the third one is called Ihsan. Now, if we look at it in terms of dimensionality, the first dimension is Islam. That's the first dimension, which would relate to like a vertical dimension, or horizontal rather. The second dimension is Iman, which would be the dimension of height. So you have breadth and height. And the third dimension is Ihsan, which would be related to depth. So here's our 3-dimensionality there in the tradition. Now the last question in the hadith is about the end of time. So here we bring in the 4th dimension, which is time. So in this hadith, we're looking at 4 dimensions within the tradition. Modern Islam has focused on Islam, and I'm using Islam as a rubric for Islam being the outward, Iman being the inward, and Ihsan being the transcendent or the universal aspect. And then finally, the idea of time and how it translates into the world. So, the reason there's been an incredible focus on Islam in the modern world has a lot to do with the post-colonial condition. Now, if you look, the Muslims, unlike other traditions, were very successful. If you look at the first 13 years, there was tribulation, there was hardship. But after the first 13 years, you really have a religion that had an extraordinary amount of worldly success. Within 100 some odd years, they had literally reached most of the known world. And although the Battle of Tours, which marks the stop of Islam's Western movement by Charles Martel, the fact is that really was not, according to the Muslims historians, was not a significant defeat. The Muslims weren't particularly interested at that time moving any more north, and they actually went back into Spain, and really kind of Spain was an extraordinary place. Northern Europe was dark. It was there was a lot of clouds. These were mostly people that were coming from the middle part of the world. And so they went back into Spain and spent several hundred years there developing extraordinary civilization. Then there's 2 major events. One, the fall of Cordoba, which really sent repercussions throughout the Muslim world, because Cordoba became an extraordinary center of learning in the Muslim world. And within 100 years, you've got the fall of Baghdad at the hands of the Mughals. Massive impact. This is the heartland that is defeated. And this is the first time that the Muslims really felt defeat in a very, very powerful and traumatic way. Nonetheless, energies are regrouped. The Mughals will become Muslims, actually reinvigorating the tradition. Spain becomes a thorn in the side. Lamenting poets to this day. There are Arab poets that write about Spain and the loss of Spain to this day. Spain is very much in the Muslim consciousness to this day. It's odd for us to think about this, right? But really the Muslims do feel a sense of grief and loss when Andalusia is mentioned, Al-Andalus. Now, what you see happen when Napoleon reaches Egypt, and literally, it's interesting enough, he sends a letter to the Egyptians off the shore, telling them he hasn't come to destroy the Quran or the Islamic teachings, but to honor them. And it's kind of odd. But then he comes in, he invades Egypt, And the Mamluks put up an extraordinary fight, but they were grossly outnumbered in terms of technology. The weaponry was much more sophisticated. You're dealing with people that were still fighting with swords and things, and they were coming up against very serious technological advancement. That, when Egypt feels that, right? Napoleon's eventually defeated in Palestine and moves back, but there is a very traumatic experience within the Muslim world. The idea of Egypt being attacked and actually for a short period of time succumbs to the colonial power. And you just start seeing the colonial incursion increasing. North Africa begins to become defeated, different places. Now, the Muslims were looking for a reason to try to understand this, because for centuries in their psyche, this is God's religion, we're the defenders of God's one true religion, right? And now we're actually being defeated. Different responses. Some of them said, clearly a sign of the end of time. There's a hadith which is a verifiable, sound hadith from the Prophet Muhammad. There will come a time in which the great nations of the West will attack my ummah and eat from them, in other words, devour their riches like people eat from a plate of food. Sound hadith. Many Muslims started using this to say, well, this is fulfillment of prophecy. Other Muslims said this is too defeatist and began to explain it in terms of technological superiority. What we did is we abandoned our tradition, right, of research, of trying to investigate the world. For the first 3-4 centuries of Islam, there was a lot of scientific development and achievement. In the 6th century, a theologian named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali wrote a book which was an attack on the philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa. The incoherence of the philosophers has a very strong impact in the Muslim world. The philosophers were not simply just how we view them now, but philosophers of those times were also scientists. There was natural philosophy. The book was a very strong attack on this tradition, saying that in a sense that people were investigating things that they really had no purpose investigating, that there was too much speculation, and that there were also elements involved in philosophy and the study of philosophy that led to a type of, could lead to disbelief potentially. So there is a refutation within 100 years by another great philosopher, theologian, and jurist like Al-Ghazali, who himself was very well versed in the philosophy of his time. Ibn Rushd, who's called Averroes, and he wrote a book, Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, which was his attack on Imam al-Ghazali. This book is rejected in the Muslim world. He's a very interesting character, and the Europeans there was a very strong school in the Middle Ages, the Averroes school, of which Thomas Aquinas, whose teacher Albertus Magnus, is heavily influenced by Ibn Rushd, Averroes. And he actually, the commentaries, Ibn Rushd wrote 3 commentaries on Aristotle, the small, the middle, or the lesser, the middle, and the greatest, for 3 levels of understanding. And these are translated into Latin and spread quite rapidly in Europe. So the Europeans began to take the rational model at the same time that the Muslims are rejecting it. It's a very interesting phenomenon.